Hello and welcome to our week on urban and agricultural revolutions in Europe in the 17th, 18th, and stretching even a little bit into the 19th century here this week.
And stretching back into the 16th.
Important point, actually. We're looking at the Atlantic world. We're looking at, we will be looking at colonization in the Atlantic world, in the Caribbean, and North America, and South America in later weeks. But of course, this is the backdrop to all of this is an expanding, developing, and empowering Europe in this time period. And we've looked at some political changes that are taking place in Europe in this time period. We're going to be looking at some economic changes that are taking place in this time period as well. Behind me, you see a map of London from the 16th century.
16th.
And London's one of the biggest cities in the world, and it's growing dramatically in this time period. Several European cities are growing dramatically in this time period, but London certainly stands out as a particularly impressively growing city. Of course, to have a growing city, you need food. You need to be able to feed those people, and that means that they need to be able to produce more food. Urban people do not produce their own food. They, some small amounts of it, but really not very much at all. So you need a strong countryside behind all of that, an improving, developing agriculture behind all of that. And that's going to be one of the basic questions we're going to be looking at today. How did this happen? Why did this happen? And interestingly, even when did this happen? Because as we'll see, there's some debate on exactly when this revolution actually happened, which of course begs the question, how revolutionary was it if we can't even spot it in time? But certainly there was a massive increase in agricultural productivity in this time period, and that enables this urban growth. So our big question this week is going to be to look at a secondary consideration, secondary literature consideration this week. We're going to look at two authors who have different interpretations of when that agricultural revolution took place.
In the British Isles.
In the British Isles, exactly. They're both looking at Great Britain. They're both examining basic agricultural economic data, and they're trying to determine when the big changes actually took place. And they arrive at quite different answers. In fact, they're off by almost 200 years. So that's a pretty big difference in understanding a basic story. And so we'll look at Eric Kerridge, who emphasizes the 17th century, and Mark Overton, who emphasizes the late 18th and early 19th century. And we'll look at the arguments that they make, but also the kinds of evidence that they bring forward to answer those questions. And so you're going to talk for a few minutes here about how we can approach that basic question, how we can think about that as we study these basic questions, the basic questions of evidence that these guys bring forward, and then the interpretation of that evidence.
Yeah, so far, you're right, Annie. Well, so far, of course you're right, but so far in the course, we've been getting everyone to examine what historians for shorthand call primary sources, sources that are that give as direct as possible kinds of evidence for the questions we're trying to answer. But for our focus this week, we're going to be looking at secondary sources, sources that aren't from the English early modern era. They're not from the period from the 16th through the 19th century, which is the period we're trying to understand in this lesson. We're looking at sources from the late 20th and early 21st century by two historians. This secondary literature is what we might call historiographical literature. It's a term that historians use to talk about literature that interprets or gives accounts of evidence from the past. Eric Kerridge and Mark Overton are two quite well-known economic and social historians who have, as you outlined already, provided very different answers to the same basic questions. When did the English agricultural economy transform in a fundamental way? They provide different answers, not because one of them is necessarily wrong and the other is necessarily right. They argue about that in other writings, not writing that we have provided for you, but rather writing that is part of a larger discussion, a larger historiographical discussion. The basic thing for everyone to understand is that it's normal for historians to disagree. And why might that be the case? As you said, the evidence for big questions, and even for very specific questions, is often not clear. It's fragmentary often, so we have to try to draw the best conclusions we can as historians, students of history, from the available evidence. That's what we're going to be doing in every week of this course in our lessons and forum discussions, and that's what historians always do on a bigger scale. So for this week, the historical thinking challenge is to understand secondary sources, sources about the past, sources about the English agricultural revolution and when it happened. And then, so we don't have to think about one historian being more biased than the other. They have different perspectives and different biases, we might say. We're trying to understand these different perspectives and these different interpretations on the complex evidence from the past. And one of the questions that everyone could examine is, what kinds of evidence do Kerridge and Overton point to? Is it the same? Or do they point to different kinds of evidence to answer a basic question about change and continuity in English agriculture? So that's one point about secondary sources. With particular reference to the lesson this week, it's good to keep in mind for every week that we have and for any historical question, it's good to look at interpretations of evidence from the past, secondary sources, and then also primary sources, evidence from the past societies, peoples, and events that we're trying to understand. A basic question of historical method. That's about the English agricultural revolution. You also, Danny, pointed to change in cities, the growth of cities. So thinking about this, another basic historical interpretation, or question of historical interpretation, we've got the question of continuity and change. We can see that with regard to this interpretive issue about the English agricultural and the British agricultural revolutions, but we can also see it in change in maps of the city of London. One of the bits of evidence that we highlight in our introduction are two maps, not just the one behind us right now, but another map from a couple of centuries later, from the 18th century, that shows just how rapidly London expanded. It's not the only bit of evidence about the growth of London, but it's primary evidence that all of us can look at to try to think about and understand and make sense of this rapid growth of London over many generations. And so continuity and change, different types of sources, primary and secondary. How do we make sense of these changes with using these different types of sources? A challenge for any topic, and in particular for this lesson. A good point to wrap up, perhaps.
I think so.